In the long history of the ancient world, few places seemed as full of grandeur, ambition and intrigue as the city of Rome. Its marble temples, crowded markets and bustling forums stood as proof of a civilization that was both powerful and restless. To walk through its streets in the late Republic was to feel the hum of life all around, merchants calling out their wares, children playing near fountains, soldiers returning from distant campaigns, and senators dressed in their white togas making their way toward the Curia, the great meeting house of the Senate. But beneath the outward display of order and ceremony, there was a tension that never seemed far away. Rome was a city of power, and power was never easily shared. The Senate was filled with men from noble families, proud of their ancestry and wealth. Each one carried ambitions, some quiet and modest, others vast and unspoken. Friendships were forged and broken, promises were made and forgotten, alliances shifted like sand beneath the feet. The Republic was a stage, and its actors were men who played their parts with both hope and suspicion. For centuries, Rome had been governed by its traditions, by elected officials, by councils, and by the shared understanding that no single man should hold too much control. This balance of power had carried Rome through wars and expansion, through victories that stretched its influence across the Mediterranean. Yet as Rome grew richer and its empire larger, the old balance began to falter. Wealth and glory flowed into the city, but so did envy, rivalry, and the hunger for more. Politics in Rome was not simply a matter of laws and debates. It was also personal. Men competed for office, spent vast sums to win elections, and used public games and spectacles to gather support. In the Forum, voices rang out with oratory meant to sway the people. In the Senate, speeches dripped with careful flattery or veiled insult. And always, beneath the surface, there was the knowledge that words alone might not be enough. To succeed in Rome was to climb a ladder where each rung was contested, and where those who stood in the way were often treated as obstacles to be removed. In earlier days, disagreements in the Senate had been settled with sharp words or legal challenges. But by the 2nd century before Christ, something darker had begun to creep in. The stakes were higher now, control of provinces, of armies, of wealth beyond imagining. Rivalries sharpened. Rumors spread more quickly. And at times, hands reached not only for scrolls and speeches, but for daggers hidden beneath cloaks. Rome was a city of ceremony, yet violence was never far away. Gladiators fought in the arenas, soldiers marched in triumphal processions, and crowds gathered to see both victory and blood. The culture of the Republic accepted that power was tied to force, and that those who dared to challenge the order must sometimes pay the price with their lives. Assassination, though whispered of rather than proclaimed, became a shadowed part of politics, a tool wielded by the desperate, the ambitious, and the fearful. But it would be wrong to imagine that Rome was always tense, or that every senator walked in constant fear. Much of the time, the city was alive with ordinary rhythms. Markets bustled with the smell of bread, olives, and wine. The Tiber River carried barges filled with goods from distant lands. Festivals filled the streets with music and color, celebrating the gods who were believed to watch over the city. Families gathered for meals, children recited lessons, priests tended temples, and artisans shaped their crafts. Yet even in these moments of peace, the larger forces of ambition and rivalry lingered, ready to rise again when opportunity appeared. The late Republic became a time when politics and violence were intertwined more often. It was not that daggers ruled Rome, but rather that men began to believe they might. The Senate still met, elections were still held, speeches still thundered in the Forum. But when passions ran too high, when reforms threatened privilege, or when ambition grew too bold, those who opposed one another sometimes chose silence not through debate but through blood. This pattern, once begun, proved difficult to stop. Each act of violence seemed to invite another, each assassination leaving wounds not only in families, but in the fabric of the Republic itself. For every man struck down, there were others who whispered of revenge, and others still who learned that such methods could be used again. What had once been shocking became, little by little, a part of Rome's political life, a shadow always near them, arble halls of power. And yet, assassination in Rome was rarely a simple act. It was not carried out without thought, nor without consequence. And those who took such steps often believed they were saving the Republic, preserving tradition, or defending the people. Others sought only to clear their path toward greater glory. The motives were as varied as the men themselves, some noble, some selfish, many mixed. In this way, assassination became both a symptom and a cause of Rome's troubles, a reflection of a republic struggling to hold itself together as ambition stretched its seams. As the years unfolded, names would be remembered: the Gracchi brothers, who sought reform and met violent ends; Sulla and Marius, whose rivalry stained the city with blood; Julius Caesar, whose rise and fall became the most famous assassination of them all. Their stories are part of a larger pattern, one where ideals and violence met, and where the fate of the Republic was decided not only in debate, but in moments of sudden and silent death. Rome was not the first society to know assassination, nor the last. But in its streets, in its senate, and in its palaces, the pattern was given a stage as vast as any in history. The assassins of Rome were not only men with daggers, they were also men with visions, with fears, with hopes for a republic that they believed must either be defended or shaped by their hands. And so, to begin the story of Roman assassins is to begin with the Republic itself, a city of light and shadow, of marble temples and whispered plots, of speeches meant to stir the people and secrets meant to silence rivals. It is to step into a world where ambition was boundless and where the struggle for power sometimes led men to believe that the only way forward was through the stillness of another's fall. In the 2nd century before Christ, Rome was not yet the empire of later centuries, but already it stretched across seas and provinces, its armies victorious, its influence vast. Wealth poured into the city from conquered lands, filling the treasuries of senators and nobles. Marble temples rose, villas expanded, and luxuries from Greece, Egypt, and beyond appeared in Roman markets. Yet as riches grew, so too did inequality. The gap between the wealthy elite and the common people widened, and the farmers, who had once been the backbone of Rome, found themselves struggling to survive. It was in this setting that two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, sought to bring change. They were not outsiders to Roman politics. They came from a noble family, their father a respected general, their mother Cornelia remembered as one of the most virtuous and admired women of her time. The Gracchi were raised with both privilege and purpose, taught to value the Republic and its people. And yet, as they grew into manhood, they saw clearly the cracks spreading through Rome's society and their resolve to act. Tiberius was the elder. Tall, dignified, and known for his eloquence, he carried himself with the calm assurance of a man born into leadership. In 133 BCE, he was elected tribune of the plebs, an office meant to protect the interests of the common people. With that position came the power to propose laws, to speak before the assemblies, and to defend the rights of those who had little voice in the Senate. Tiberius chose to use that power to address the growing crisis of land. For generations, Rome's small farmers had fought in its armies, tended their fields, and formed the backbone of its strength. But as wars grew longer and lands farther, many farmers returned home to find their fields neglected, seized by debts, or purchased cheaply by wealthy men. Great estates, worked by slaves brought from conquered lands, spread across the countryside, while poor citizens crowded into the city, landless and restless. Tiberius saw this as a danger to the Republic. If the citizens who once sustained Rome were reduced to poverty, how could the state remain strong? His answer was a law to redistribute land. It was not a radical idea. Older laws already limited how much public land one man could hold, but those limits had long been ignored. Tiberius sought to enforce them, to take excess land from the wealthy and divide it among the poor, giving families the chance to farm once again and rebuild their lives. To him, it was a matter of justice and survival. To the Senate, it was a threat. The debates grew heated. Wealthy senators, who held vast estates, opposed the law fiercely. Tiberius bypassed them, appealing directly to the people in the assembly. Crowds gathered to hear his speeches, their voices rising in support, their hopes stirred by the promise of land and dignity. But with each cheer from the people, the Senate's anger grew deeper. A Tiberius, they felt, was not only threatening their wealth, but the very balance of power. To use the tribunate so boldly, to appeal directly to the people, was seen as a dangerous step, one that could upset the careful traditions of the Republic. The conflict came to a head in the summer of 133 BCE. Tiberius, seeking re-election as tribune to continue his reforms, appeared at the assembly. Tension filled the air. Senators whispered of tyranny, of ambition too great to be trusted. A group of them, led by the Pontifex Maximus Scipio Nasica, gathered followers and marched toward the assembly. In the chaos that followed, Tiberius was struck down, beaten with clubs, stones, and fragments of benches. His supporters scattered, his body left lifeless on the Capitoline Hill. It was the first time in centuries that political disagreement in Rome had ended in such violence. The death of Tiberius Gracchus shocked the city. Some mourned him as a champion of the people, others condemned him as a would-be tyrant. But all recognized that something had changed. The line between debate and bloodshed had been crossed, and it could not easily be restored. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius Gracchus took up his cause. Where Tiberius had been calm and dignified, Gaius was fiery, passionate, and skilled at stirring crowds with his words. He too was elected tribune, and he too sought to reform the Republic. But his vision was broader. He not only continued the push for land reform, but also sought to provide grain at fair prices, to extend citizenship to Rome's allies, and to hold officials accountable for corruption. And Gaius's energy drew supporters from many corners: farmers, workers, even some allies who longed for recognition. But once again, the Senate resisted. His reforms threatened their control, their privileges, their comfort. As his popularity grew, so too did their fear. In 121 BCE, tensions spilled once more into violence. Gaius, pressed by opposition, gathered his followers on the Aventine Hill. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state, and armed men marched against him. Surrounded, Gaius chose not to be captured. With the help of a loyal servant, he took his own life, ending his struggle in sorrow. Hundreds of his followers were slain in the aftermath, their blood staining the streets of Rome. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers left a mark that Rome would never erase. They were remembered as reformers, as men who sought to restore dignity to the poor and balance to the Republic. To some, they were heroes, martyrs for justice. To others, they were dangerous agitators who had overstepped tradition. But to all, they were a sign that Rome had changed. No longer could it be said that political disputes were settled only by words. Violence had entered the life of the Republic, and once begun, it would return again and again. The assassinations of the Gracchi were not the last, Rome would know. They were rather the first cracks in the great stone of the Republic, cracks that would spread until the structure itself began to crumble. And yet, even in their deaths, the Gracchi carried influence. Later leaders would invoke their names, their causes, their memory. Some would claim to walk in their footsteps, others to void their mistakes. Their story became a caution and a lesson, a reminder that ambition, reform, and resistance could bring both hope and ruin. When we reflect on their lives now, it is not only their violent ends that stand out, but also the vision that drove them, the belief that Rome could not survive unless justice was given to its people. Their struggle, their hopes, and their sacrifices remain part of the long story of a republic where ambition and reform met in the shadow of daggers. After the deaths of the Gracchi brothers, Rome did not return to peace. For a time, the city carried on with its routines. Senators met in the Curia, markets bustled in the Forum, and armies marched abroad. But beneath these daily rhythms lay a sense that something had changed. A violence, once shocking, had entered the life of the Republic. The murders of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus had shown that daggers could be used in politics, and once that line was crossed, it became easier for others to follow. In the decades that followed, new figures rose to prominence, and with them came new struggles. Among the most memorable were Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, two men whose rivalry would shake Rome and set patterns that echoed long after their deaths. They were very different in temperament and background, yet alike in ambition. Each sought power, each claimed loyalty to the Republic, and each believed that his vision alone could preserve Rome. Marius was the first to rise. Born into a family of little distinction, he earned fame through military service. His courage and skill on the battlefield won him both honor and the loyalty of his soldiers. He reformed the Roman army, opening its ranks to poorer citizens who had little property but much eagerness to serve. In doing so, he created legions tied not only to Rome but to himself, men who looked to their general for land and reward. His popularity grew, and he was elected consul, Rome's highest office, an extraordinary 7 times. For the common people, he was a hero, a man who had risen from modest roots to the greatest heights. For the Senate, he was both useful and dangerous, a figure who stood outside their traditions yet could not be ignored. And Sulla, by contrast, was born into an old patrician family, though one that had lost much of its wealth. Where Marius was blunt and straightforward, Sulla was calculating, charming when he wished, cold when he chose. He too found success in the army, distinguishing himself as a commander of talent. His soldiers admired him, his allies respected his cunning, and his enemies feared his resolve. At first, Marius and Sulla fought on the same side, sharing victories in campaigns against Rome's foes. But as Rome's influence stretched and new wars arose, their rivalry sharpened. Both sought command of armies, both sought glory, and both believed the other unworthy of the power he held. The breaking point came with the war against King Mithridates of Pontus, a formidable enemy in the east. The Senate gave command of the campaign to Sulla, but Marius, unwilling to let his rival claim such a prize, used his influence to have the decision reversed. Sulla, furious, did what no Roman general had done before. He marched his army on Rome itself. Soldiers, who were meant to defend the Republic against foreign foes, now entered their own city at the command of their general. Streets that had once echoed with the voices of merchants and children now shook with the tramp of legions. The sight was shocking, and yet it was only the beginning. Sulla seized control, declared Marius an enemy, and forced him into exile. But Rome's politics were never simple, and fortunes shifted quickly. Marius returned with his own supporters, retaking the city in a wave of vengeance. Senators and enemies were killed, their names struck from records, their homes seized. For a brief time, Marius ruled once more, though age and illness soon carried him to his death. After Marius's passing, Sulla returned. Victorious in the east, he marched again on Rome, determined to secure his position. The cycle of violence continued. Prescriptions were posted in the Forum, lists of men marked for death. Those whose names appeared were hunted, their wealth confiscated, their lives ended. Assassination had now become not a rare act, but a public policy, used to eliminate rivals and secure control. The streets of Rome, once filled with debate and oratory, now ran with fear. Sulla declared himself dictator, a role that in earlier centuries had been meant only for brief emergencies. He held the office not for weeks or months, but for years, reshaping laws, strengthening the Senate, and trying to restore the old order of the Republic. Yet his methods were harsh, and the blood left behind could not be forgotten. When he finally laid down power and retired, the city was quieter, but the memory of what had been done remained. The rivalry of Marius and Sulla revealed something that could not be undone. Armies, once loyal only to the Republic, had become loyal to their generals. Political disputes, once settled in the Senate, were now fought with swords in the streets. Assassination, exile, and civil war were no longer distant possibilities, but real tools of politics. Rome, once proud of its traditions, was being reshaped by ambition and violence. Yet even in these troubled times, life in the city went on. The markets still opened each morning, filled with the scent of fresh bread and olives. Families still gathered in the evenings, children still learned their lessons, festivals still filled the streets with music and color. Rome was not only a place of daggers and power struggles, it was also a living city, filled with ordinary people carrying on in the shadow of events they could not control. When we look back now, the story of Marius and Sulla seems like a dark turning point, a moment when the Republic's traditions bent beneath the weight of ambition. They were not assassins in the simplest sense, yet the violence that followed in their rivalry opened the door for others who would be. They showed Rome that power could be seized with armies, that opponents could be eliminated with blood, and that the Republic could be reshaped by force. The shadow of their choices lingered, teaching later generations that in the struggle for control, no tool was off limits. The age of political violence in Rome had begun in earnest. From the fall of the Gracchi to the rivalry of Marius and Sulla, the Republic had learned that ideals were fragile when tested by ambition. Soon, others would follow, men whose names would echo through history, whose deaths would mark the Republic's final descent into empire. Among all the names remembered from ancient Rome, perhaps none shines more brightly or more tragically than Julius Caesar. His life seemed almost like a story told in stages, a youth of promise, a man of ambition, a general of brilliance, and finally, a leader whose rise was so swift and so certain that those around him began to fear what it meant for the Republic. His death, on the Ides of March, became one of the most famous assassinations in history, whispered of ever since as a symbol of both ambition and betrayal. Caesar was born in 100 BCE into the gens Julia, an old patrician family that claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself. Yet though his ancestry was noble, his family was not among the wealthiest or most powerful of the Roman elite. From his earliest years, Caesar carried both the pride of his lineage and the need to prove himself. He was clever, ambitious, and gifted with a presence that drew others to him. His education was steeped in oratory, philosophy, and law, preparing him for the public life of a Roman statesman. As a young man, he moved carefully through Rome's shifting politics, aligning himself with the populares, the faction that claimed to speak for the common people. He understood that popularity, once won, could carry Ammon further than noble birth alone. Through marriages, alliances, and careful choices, he built connections that widened his influence. His debts grew as he spent lavishly on games and entertainments for the public, but his reputation grew as well, and in Rome, reputation was often the greater currency. Caesar's true brilliance, however, shone in the field. As a general, he was bold yet calculating, able to inspire loyalty in his soldiers and to seize opportunity when others hesitated. His campaigns in Gaul lasted for nearly a decade, carrying Roman legions deep into lands that had never known Roman rule. Battle after battle, city after city, he extended the borders of the Republic and filled Rome's coffers with wealth. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written in clear and simple Latin, allowed him to shape his own image, presenting himself as both hero and historian. The victories in Gaul made Caesar a man of unmatched fame. His soldiers adored him, following him through hardship, trusting him completely. The people of Rome celebrated him, seeing in his triumphs both glory and prosperity. But among the Senate, his power stirred unease. Rome's traditions had long distrusted any man who grew too great, for the Republic was built on the idea of shared power. Caesar, with his wealth, his armies, and his popularity, seemed to some like a king in all but name, and kingship was something Romans had sworn never to accept again. The rivalry sharpened between Caesar and another great Roman, Pompey the Great. Once allies through the so-called First Triumvirate with Crassus, their friendship dissolved into suspicion. When Caesar's term in Gaul ended, the Senate, influenced by Pompey, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. And to obey would mean safety, but also the end of his power. And to refuse would mean defiance, perhaps even civil war. In January of 49 BCE, Caesar made his choice. Leading a single legion, he crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary beyond which no general was permitted to bring troops into Italy. The words he is said to have spoken, "Alea iacta est," "Thedi is cast," marked the point of no return. Civil war followed, as Caesar and Pompey vied for control of the Republic. The struggle was fierce but brief. Pompey fled east, only to meet his end in Egypt. Caesar, victorious, returned to Rome as master of the state. As dictator, Caesar moved quickly. He reformed the calendar, introduced laws to ease debts, expanded the Senate, and planned colonies for veterans and the poor. His vision was wide, seeking not only to stabilize Rome but to shape its future. Yet with each act, his power grew more absolute. Statues were raised in his honor, honors piled upon him, and whispers began that he might accept the title of king. For Romans, who remembered with pride their expulsion of kings centuries earlier, such whispers were alarming. Among the Senate, unease turned to fear. A group of men, some of them once close to Caesar, began to speak of saving the Republic. They believed that if one man held too much power, the Republic itself would die. Among them were Marcus Junius Brutus, descended from the ancient family that had once driven out Rome's last king, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man of sharp mind and deep resentment. Together with others, they formed a conspiracy. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate meeting in the theatre of Pompey. He was confident, perhaps even weary of warnings. Foreprophets and friends had urged him to beware that day. Yet he dismissed the omens, trusting in his fortune and his authority. As he took his seat, the conspirators gathered close. At first they approached with petitions, their voices low. Then in an instant daggers flashed. One after another the senators struck. And Caesar fell, pierced by many blows, his blood staining the floor of the chamber. And tradition holds that he saw Brutus among them, and, in sorrow rather than anger, let fall words of recognition before collapsing. The deed was done. The senators believed they had saved the Republic. Yet when the news spread, the city did not rejoice. The people mourned Caesar, their champion, their general, their provider. His body was carried to the Forum, where crowds wept openly. His death, meant to restore balance, instead opened the door to further chaos. Civil war followed once more, and the Republic itself staggered toward its end. The assassination of Julius Caesar remains one of history's most remembered acts, not for its violence, but for its meaning. It was not the death of a tyrant alone, nor the defense of a republic alone, but a moment when ambition and fear collided. For some, Caesar was a hero struck down by envy. For others, he was a would-be king rightly stopped. But for Rome, his death was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would carry it from republic to empire. When we think of that day now, we imagine not only the daggers and the fall, but the silence that followed, the senators standing in shock, the people grieving in the streets, the sense that a great story had reached both its climax and its turning point. Caesar's life and death remind us that power, once grasped, is rarely surrendered, and that those who fear it will sometimes reach for shadows rather than words. And so, in the story of Roman assassins, the Ides of March stand as both the most famous moment and the most haunting, a reminder of how ambition, rivalry, and fear can reshape the fate of nations. The fall of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March was not the end of the story, but rather the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. The men who had conspired against him, more than 60 senators in all, believed they had saved the Republic. They imagined that by striking Caesar down, they had restored balance, preserved tradition, and returned power to the Senate where it had long belonged. Yet events after that day revealed something far more complicated. Rome was not ready to return to the old ways, and the people did not see Caesar's death as liberation. Among the conspirators, two names stood tallest: Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Brutus was remembered as a man of honor, descended from the ancient line that had cast out Rome's last king nearly 5 centuries before. His ancestry was often invoked, and he was seen by Manias a living symbol of republican virtue. Cassius, older and sharper, was a man of intellect and deep resentment, less admired but more practical. Together, they and their fellows believed they had done something noble, something history would one day praise. In the hours after the assassination, however, the city did not react as they hoped. The senators fled in confusion, unsure if the people would rise in support or in anger. The Forum, usually alive with debate and commerce, was filled with uncertainty. Some citizens hid in their homes, fearing riots. Others whispered in groups, wondering what the killing meant. Caesar had been popular with the people. His games, his reforms, his generosity had won their loyalty. To many, he was not a tyrant, but a protector. His death brought sorrow more than relief. Brutus and Cassius tried to calm the city with words. They entered the Forum, speaking of liberty, of the Republic saved, of tyranny overthrown. Brutus, in particular, pleaded with the crowd to see their act not as murder but as sacrifice, as the defense of tradition. And for a brief moment, there was quiet, even a measure of respect. The people listened, but their hearts remained uncertain. It was at Caesar's funeral that the tide turned. His body was brought to the Forum, laid out for all to see. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and loyal supporter, spoke to the gathered crowds. His speech began gently, with respect for the conspirators, but his words were chosen with care. Slowly, he reminded the people of Caesar's deeds, his victories, his generosity, the wealth he had brought to Rome. He pointed to Caesar's wounds, naming the men who had struck them. He read Caesar's will, which left gifts to the Roman people. The mood shifted, sorrow becoming anger. Cries rose from the crowd, and soon the forum erupted into violence. The funeral pyre became a blaze, and the city trembled with rage. Brutus and Cassius, seeing the storm they had unleashed, withdrew. They left Rome, gathering supporters in the provinces, raising armies in the name of the Republic. Their vision was clear to them: to restore the old balance of power, to prevent any one man from ruling as Caesar had. Yet the reality was more complex. The people's loyalty had shifted. They wanted not endless debates in the Senate, but strong leadership, protection, and stability. The Republic as it had been seemed fragile, unable to meet their hopes. In Rome, Caesar's allies moved quickly. Mark Antony, joined by Octavian, Caesar's young grandnephew and adopted heir, formed an alliance with Marcus Lepidus. And together they called themselves the Second Triumvirate, 3 men sharing power, bound by common cause. Their first act was to seek vengeance. Prescriptions were posted, names listed publicly for death, wealth confiscated, enemies struck down. Among those who fell was Cicero, the great orator, whose voice had long defended the Republic. His end was sorrowful, and his name added to the long list of lives claimed by political violence. Meanwhile, Brutus and Cassius gathered their strength in the east. Armies swelled beneath their banners, soldiers drawn by loyalty to their cause or the promise of reward. They marched, camped, and prepared, knowing that Rome itself would soon be decided not in speeches, but in battle. In 42 BCE, at Philippi in Macedonia, the two sides met. The battle stretched across days, fierce and unrelenting. Brutus and Cassius fought bravely, their soldiers pressing hard, their hopes alive. But fortune turned against them. Cassius, misled by false reports, took his own life rather than face defeat. Brutus fought on, steady and resolute, but when the tide could no longer be held, he too chose death, falling on his word in the tradition of Roman honor. With their passing, the cause of the assassins was ended. The Republic, which they had sought to restore, did not return. Instead, their act had opened the way for something new. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus divided the Roman world, their power growing, their rivalry simmering. Soon enough, Octavian alone would rise, taking the title Augustus, and the Republic would give way to the empire. The consequences of Caesar's assassination were thus not what the conspirators intended. They believed they were saving Rome, but in truth, they hastened the end of the Republic. Their daggers struck down a man, but not the tide of history that carried Rome toward one-man rule. Brutus and Cassius became remembered not only as assassins, but as men whose idealism met reality in failure. Yet their story remained powerful, told and retold through the centuries. To some, they were heroes of liberty, men who risked all Taurus's tyranny. And to others, they were traitors who murdered a leader beloved by the people. To Rome itself, they were a symbol of how deeply divided the Republic had become, and of how even noble intentions could lead to ruin when guided by violence. When we reflect on their lives now, it is not only the clash of swords and the silence of their deaths that linger, but the image of two men standing at a crossroads in history. Brutus, torn between friendship and duty. Cassius, driven by resentment and fear. Together they chose a path that reshaped Rome forever. Their actions remind us that assassination, once begun, rarely ends as planned. The consequences ripple outward, touching not only those who fall, but entire nations, entire generations. And so the story of Brutus and Cassius is not only thestry of daggers drawn in the Senate House, but also of what followed: civil war, vengeance, and the slow fading of the Republic. It is a story of men who believed they were saving something precious, but who instead marked its final decline. After the deaths of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, the cause of the assassins had ended, but the wounds they left upon Rome were far from healed. The Republic, which they had tried to restore, was now little more than a memory, fragile and fading. In its place rose new powers, men who claimed to defend Rome, but who divided it among themselves. This new arrangement was called the Second Triumvirate, an alliance of three men who would shape the next stage of Roman history: Mark Antony, Marcus Lepidus, and Octavian, the young heir of Julius Caesar. The alliance was born of necessity, not trust. Each man carried ambitions, each carried suspicion, yet together they saw that unity was needed to seize control of a restless Rome. In 43 BCE, the Senate granted them extraordinary powers, allowing them to govern not as individuals, but as a three-headed authority. Their word was law, their decisions absolute. To the weary city, it seemed as if the Republic had given way to something new, though it still kept the old names and ceremonies. Their first act was one of vengeance. The memory of Caesar's assassination still lingered, and the triumvirs sought to eliminate anyone who had supported it or who might oppose them now. They created lists called proscriptions, names of men marked for death. These lists were posted publicly, nailed to the walls of the Forum for all to see. Wealthy citizens, senators, equestrians, and even those once admired were suddenly declared enemies. Their property was confiscated, their lives forfeit, their families left grieving. It was a time of fear, when each morning could bring news that another name had been added. Among those names was one that still resonates: Marcus Tullius Cicero, the orator, philosopher, and statesman. Cicero had long been a voice for the Republic, defending its traditions with words that carried both beauty and force. His speeches had swayed assemblies, guided debates, and stood against the ambitions of men like Catiline in earlier years. He had once supported Caesar, then opposed him, and after Caesar's death, Cicero placed his hopes in Octavian, believing the young man could restore the Republic. But Cicero's sharp tongue had made him enemies. He spoke against Mark Antony with passion, delivering a series of speeches known as the Philippics, modelled after the orations of the Greek Demosthenes against Philip of Macedon. In these, Cicero called Antony corrupt, dangerous, and unworthy of Rome. His words struck deeply, wounding Antony's pride and stirring his anger. When the triumvirs met to decide whose names would appear on the lists of proscription, Antony demanded Cicero's. Octavian hesitated, for Cicero had supported him, but in the end he allowed it, perhaps sacrificing one man to preserve the alliance. Cicero was at his villa when the assassins came. He had considered fleeing across the sea, but age on resignation slowed him. When soldiers arrived, he did not resist. And tradition tells us that he stretched out his neck willingly, saying, "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier, but try to kill me properly." His head and hands were taken to Rome, displayed upon the rostra in the Forum, the very place where his voice had once echoed with brilliance. It was a grim symbol, meant to silence opposition, to show that even the greatest orator of Rome could not withstand the will of the triumvirs. The death of Cicero marked more than the end of one man's life. It was the silencing of a voice that had spoken for liberty, for law, for the traditions of the Republic. His writings, his speeches, his philosophy would survive, studied for centuries, but his death was a sign that Rome had fully entered an age where power belonged not to words, but to armies and alliances. The proscriptions continued, striking down many others until the city itself seemed cloaked in sorrow. Families mourned fathers and brothers, wealth was seized, and fear hung heavy in every household. Yet for the triumvirs, These acts secured control. With opposition crushed, they divided the Roman world among themselves. Antony took the east, Octavian the west, and Lepidus Africa. For a time the arrangement held, though beneath it lay mistrust and rivalry. As Antony sailed east, his path led to Egypt and to Cleopatra, the queen whose name would become entwined with his own. Octavian remained in Italy, consolidating his power, building his base of loyalty among soldiers and citizens. Lepidus, though part of the alliance, found himself increasingly sidelined, his role fading as the ambitions of the other two grew. The stage was quietly being set for another great conflict, though for the moment, Rome rested in uneasy peace. For the ordinary people of Rome, life continued amidst the shadows. Markets opened, children learned their lessons, festivals honored the gods. Yet the presence of soldiers was constant, and the weight of fear never fully lifted. The memory of Cicero's severed head on the rostra lingered in the minds of many, a reminder that no voice, however great, was safe when power was decided by lists and decrees. And yet, even in this dark time, Cicero's words endured. His writings on law, duty, and philosophy continued to be read, copied, and cherished by those who believed in the Republic's ideals. Though silenced in body, his voice lived on, whispering to future generations of justice, of balance, and of the dangers of unchecked ambition. The story of the Second Triumvirate and Cicero's end is a story of transition. It was the moment when Rome turned more fully from the old republic toward a new order. It showed that assassinations, once shocking, had become tools of governance, no longer the acts of desperate individuals, but the decrees of rulers. It revealed how even noble voices could be silenced in the tide of ambition, and how power, once seized, demanded ever more ruthless acts to maintain. And yet, within the sorrow, there remained the seeds of what was to come. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus had gained control, but they had also set in motion rivalries that would shape the next stage of Rome's story. Cicero was gone, but his memory endured, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, ideals could outlast the who tried to destroy them. When Brutus and Cassius fell at Philippi, the dream of restoring the Republic slipped away. In their place rose men who claimed the legacy of Caesar, who promised order, and who wielded armies with ease. The Second Triumvirate had been born from necessity, but alliances forged from ambition rarely last. In time, it would be Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who stood alone, shaping Rome in his image. His rise would mark the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire, a shift so profound that even the daggers which had haunted Roman politics seemed for a time to grow quiet. Octavian was still young when he inherited Caesar's name, wealth, and loyalty. At first, many underestimated him, seeing only a boy in the shadow of great men. But Octavian was careful, patient, and deliberate. Where others sought glory in bold strokes, he built power step by step, weaving alliances, rewarding loyalty, and waiting for the right moment to act. His partnership with Antony and Lepidus served him well in the beginning, but once the assassins of Caesar were gone, their unity frayed. Lepidus faded first, stripped of influence and sent into a quiet exile. Mark Antony remained, his strength bolstered by his command in the east and his alliance with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Their partnership stirred both fascination and suspicion. To Antony's soldiers, Cleopatra was a symbol of wealth and grandeur, but to many Romans, she represented foreign influence, a queen entwining herself in Rome's destiny. Octavian saw this, and with steady words and careful propaganda, he painted Antony not as a Roman statesman, but as a man seduced by an Eastern monarch, abandoning his duty. The tension grew until war seemed inevitable. In 31 BCE, the two sides met in a great naval battle at Actium. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his trusted general Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled to Egypt, where pursued and cornered they chose death over capture. Their passing marked not only the end of their story, but the end of Rome's long era of civil wars. Octavian returned to Rome as the unchallenged master of the Republic. And yet, Octavian did not seize the title of king. He understood the Roman heart, which still recoiled from monarchy. Instead, he accepted honors from the Senate, titles given to him one by one until he stood above all others without appearing to demand it. In 27 BCE, he was granted the name Augustus, their revered one. He called himself princeps, or first citizen, carefully cloaking his power in the language of the old republic. But all knew the truth. Rome was no longer governed by Senate and people alone. It was guided by the will of one man. Under Augustus, the Republic was reshaped into the empire. The Senate remained, elections continued, and old traditions were honored, but true authority rested in Augustus's hands. He commanded the armies, controlled the provinces, and decided the course of Rome. Where once ambition had been contested in the forum with speeches and in the curia with votes, now it was channeled into service of the emperor. The daggers that had once flashed in the Senate grew still, for no senator dared repeat the act of the Ides of March. The memory of Caesar's fall and the vengeance that followed was still too fresh. Instead of open assassinations, Augustus ruled through subtler means. He rewarded loyalty generously, weaving networks of obligation and gratitude. He punished opposition quietly, with exile, silence, or the quiet removal of privileges. He filled the city with monuments, temples, and forums, each carrying his name, each reminding the people of his generosity. He reorganized the army, ensuring its loyalty not to the Senate, but to himself. In this way, he built stability that Rome had not known for generations. The people, weary of decades of civil war, welcomed the peace. This peace came to be known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a time when the frontiers were secured, the roads were safe, and trade flowed across the empire. For ordinary Romans, life regained rhythm. Markets bustled with goods from Spain, Africa, and the East. Farmers tended fields without fear of conscription. Families gathered for festivals honoring Augustus, alongside the gods. The empire stretched wide, but at its center the city of Rome thrived under the calm order he had created. For senators, the old independence was gone, but many accepted the new arrangement. They still debated, still wore their togas of office, still held titles, but their power was shaped by Augustus's will. Some resented it quietly, yet they also remembered the chaos of the past, the assassinations, the proscriptions, the civil wars. Against that memory, Augustus's steady hand seemed preferable. The daggers that once silenced rivals had been set aside, not because ambition had vanished, but because Augustus had left little room for rivals to rise. Even so, whispers never entirely ceased. Some wondered whether Augustus had preserved the Republic in form only, while hollowing out its spirit. Others admired him as the man who had saved Rome from itself, turning conflict into order. His reign stretched for decades, long enough that an entire generation grew up knowing no other way of life. By the time he died in 14 CE, the Republic was no more than a memory, and the empire was the only reality Rome had ever known. The story of Augustus is not one of daggers drawn in the dark, but of daggers made unnecessary. He understood that assassination was born of fear and rivalry, and he worked tirelessly to remove the conditions that gave rise to such violence. Where others had been bold and reckless, he was careful and deliberate. Where others sought sudden power, he built it patiently until it rested so firmly in his hands that none dared strike against him. In this way, Augustus quieted the daggers of Rome. For a time, the shadows of assassination retreated, replaced by the calm order of empire. But history moves in cycles, and though Augustus himself passed peacefully, the emperors who followed him wouldn't all be so fortunate. The daggers would return, hidden once more in cloaks and whispers, waiting for rulers less cautious, less steady, and less loved. For now, though, in the age of Augustus, Rome seemed to breathe again after long years of turmoil. The streets filled with light, the temples gleamed, and the people, from the poorest citizen to the highest senator, lived beneath the steady hand of a man who had turned chaos into calm. The Republic had ended, but in its place stood something new, an empire built on both memory and transformation, where the silence of daggers marked the beginning of a different age. When Augustus died in the year 14th CE, he left behind an empire that seemed more stable than Rome had known for generations. His long reign had quieted the daggers of the Republic, weaving peace out of chaos, and for a time his successors tried to preserve the careful balance he had built. Yet empire is rarely simple, and even the most carefully laid foundations cannot prevent the return of ambition, rivalry, and fear. As the Julio-Claudian dynasty unfolded, new emperors rose, some steady, some reckless, and in their courts the daggers that had been hidden began to stir once again. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and heir, followed him on the throne. He was capable, cautious, and at times brooding. His rule began with competence, but his nature drew him more toward retreat than display. In time, he withdrew from Rome, leaving much of the governance to officials and whispering advisors. The city carried on, the Senate still meeting, the people still gathering in the forum, but the sense of an absent emperor left a vacuum. Suspicion grew, rumors flourished, and though Tiberius lived long, his reign ended in shadows, with stories of fear and quiet executions. It was after him, however, that the empire saw one of its most startling rulers, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, remembered in history by the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, a name given to him when he was a child in military camps. At first, his rise was met with joy. He was the son of the beloved General Germanicus, the great-nephew and adopted grandson of Augustus, and the people cheered when he took power. For a brief moment, Rome seemed to welcome a young, vibrant emperor who might carry forward the Golden Age. But Caligula's reign soon turned dark. Whether from illness, madness, or the weight of unchecked power, his rule became marked by extravagance and cruelty. He demanded honors beyond tradition, built lavish projects, and at times humiliated senators with open contempt. Stories spread that he wished to be worshipped as a living god, that he appointed his horse to high office, that he squandered wealth on spectacles while burdening the people with taxes. Whether every tale was true or exaggerated by his enemies, the sense was clear. The emperor was no longer a careful steward, but a ruler who inspired fear more than respect. Within the palace, whispers of discontent grew louder. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, felt both scorned and endangered by his behavior. Senators feared his unpredictable moods, courtiers watched nervously for signs of displeasure, and even ordinary citizens began to murmur. In Rome, where Augustus had once shown restraint and subtleties, Caligula seemed reckless, a man who wielded power without measure. The end came suddenly. In January of the year 41 CE, Caligula attended games in the theatre, walking among his guards and attendants. As he returned through a passageway beneath the palace, members of the Praetorian Guard, led by an officer named Cassius Chaerea, struck. Daggers flashed, blows fell, and the young emperor, not yet 30 years old, collapsed. His wife and child were killed as well, leaving no immediate heir. For the first time in the empire, an emperor had been assassinated, not by foreign enemies or rival armies, but by those closest to him, the very men sworn to guard his life. The city erupted in confusion. Senators gathered, debating whether the death of Caligula might mean the restoration of the Republic. Some spoke of freedom, of casting aside the rule of one man. But the people, accustomed now to emperors, demanded continuity. In the palace, soldiers searching the rooms discovered Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain. He was brought before them, trembling, but instead of killing him, they saluted him as the new emperor. The Senate yielded, and the empire continued. The assassination of Caligula revealed much about the empire Augustus had built. It showed that while daggers had grown quiet under his steady hand, they had not disappeared. They had merely waited, hidden in the shadows, ready to strike when an emperor ruled without caution or restraint. It showed too that the Praetorian Guard, created to protect, could also become the power behind the throne, deciding who would live, who would fall, and who would wear the crown. For the people of Rome, life carried on as it always did. Markets opened with the morning sun, farmers tended fields beyond the city, children played in courtyards, priests carried out sacrifices in temples. Yet beneath these ordinary rhythms, the city had changed. The memory of Caligula's excesses lingered, a reminder of what could happen when power was unchecked. The knowledge that an emperor could be cut down within his own palace lingered too, a sign that the stability Augustus had created was not unshakable. In the long story of Roman assassins, the death of Caligula stands out not only for its violence, but for its meaning. It was not a defense of the Republic, as the conspirators had claimed when they struck Caesar. It was not civil war, as in the days of Marius and Sulla. It was something new, the assassination of an emperor by his own guards, an act that revealed how fragile imperial power could be when fear replaced loyalty. And yet, history moves quietly from one moment to the next. Claudius took the throne, ruling with caution where his nephew had ruled with arrogance. Rome continued, the empire endured, and life in its streets flowed on. But the daggers had stirred, and though they would rest again for a time, their return was certain. For emperors who followed, from Nero to Domitian to Commodus, the shadow of assassination would never be far away. The death of Caligula had shown the Roman world something new, that even an emperor, surrounded by guards and courtiers, could be struck down by daggers in the very heart of his own palace. With that act, the precedent was set, and though the empire continued, the shadow of assassination never again left the imperial court. For centuries afterward, whispers and conspiracies echoed through marble halls, reminding each emperor that while his power was vast, it was also fragile. Claudius, who succeeded Caligula, ruled with caution. He was a man of learning, more comfortable with books than battles, yet he proved capable. He expanded Rome's provinces, built aqueducts, and restored order. But his reign, too, was haunted by intrigue. His marriage to Agrippina the Younger, ambitious and determined, brought with it new dangers. She ensured that her son Nero was named heir, and when Claudius suddenly died in 54 CE, many whispered of poison, slipped into a dish of mushrooms. Whether true or not, the suspicion lingered, a reminder that emperors could fall not only by swords in corridors, but by cups at their own tables. Nero, young and fiery, came to power with promise, but this rule soon turned darker. He loved art, music, and spectacle, and he demanded adoration from those around him. Yet when opposition stirred, he met it with ruthless force. Senators who plotted were executed, rivals were silenced, and even his own mother, Agrippina, was put to death when her influence became too heavy. The Senate feared him, The people endured him, and the Praetorian Guard supported him so long as their loyalty was rewarded. But Rome itself grew weary. In the year 68, rebellion broke out, and Nero, abandoned by his guards, took his own life. His fall, though not by direct assassination, revealed once again that an emperor's life was always at risk when loyalty faded. In the years that followed, Rome entered a time of turmoil, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian rose in swift succession, each one taking power only to be challenged by rivals. Assassinations and suicides marked the year, the daggers and swords of soldiers, deciding who would rule. At last Vespasian, steady and practical, restored calm, founding the Flavian dynasty. Yet even in times of peace, emperors never forgot that danger lurked nearby, hidden in whispers, plots, and the shifting loyalty of those closest to them. The pattern continued. Domitian, Vespasian's younger son, ruled for many years with both energy and severity. He was a capable administrator, strengthening Rome's frontiers and finances, but he grew suspicious, ruling more by fear than trust. Senators, courtiers, and even members of his household lived under the shadow of his anger. In the year 96, a group of conspirators, including members of his own guard, struck him down in his palace chambers. His death was mourned by few, for those who had once flattered him now quickly turned to praise his successors. In the 2nd century, emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius brought stability and grandeur, their reigns remembered for peace and building rather than blood. Yet the memory of assassination never truly disappeared. Even when rulers were wise and steady, the knowledge remained that a sudden turn in fortune, a dagger in the dark, could end even the most successful reign. The 3rd century, however, brought Rome into one of its most turbulent eras, when assassination became almost a rhythm of imperial life. The empire stretched wide, its frontiers threatened by invasions, its armies restless, its loyalty fragile. Emperors rose from the ranks of generals, acclaimed by their soldiers in distant provinces, only to be cut down when another rival marched with his own army. In this age, assassination was no longer shocking but expected. Few emperors died peacefully. Many fell to their own guards, struck down in tents, in baths, or on roads between provinces. The purple robe of the emperor seemed less a symbol of power than a target for daggers. One of the most remembered was Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius. Where his father was admired as a philosopher king, Commodus was remembered for extravagance and excess. He styled himself as a gladiator, fought in the arena, and demanded worship. His behavior alarmed senators and generals alike. In 192 CE, a conspiracy formed among his closest attendants. Poison failed, but a wrestler was sent to his chambers, and there Commodus was strangled. His death ended the Antonine dynasty, and once again Rome was plunged into civil war. Through these centuries, the pattern remained. Emperors who ruled with wisdom, generosity, and restraint could live long and die peacefully, but those who ruled with cruelty, suspicion, or excess placed themselves at risk. The Senate might flatter them, the people might cheer them, the soldiers might salute them, but beneath the surface, daggers were always waiting. Sometimes the plots were whispered in the Senate. Sometimes they were formed in the barracks. Sometimes even wives, mothers, or servants played their part. The imperial court, filled with marble columns and golden halls, was also a place of quiet fear where each step might be one's last. Yet for all the assassinations, Rome endured. Emperors came and went, dynasties rose and fell, but the empire itself continued, its roads stretching across continents, its legions marching, its cities thriving. The deaths of emperors, however dramatic, were only part of a larger story, a reminder that even the mightiest were still mortal and that power, however absolute it seemed, could vanish in an instant. When we reflect on these centuries of plots and assassinations, what stands out is not only the violence, but the silence that often followed. A ruler would fall, another would rise, and the empire carried on as though nothing had changed. Markets reopened, temples filled with worshippers, children studied their lessons, and life flowed forward. Assassination became almost ordinary, woven into the fabric of political life, a rhythm as familiar as the seasons. In this way, Rome teaches us a quiet truth, that power brings with it both greatness and peril, that ambition can lift men high, but also place them within reach of the very daggers they once commanded. The emperors who followed Augustus walked always in his shadow, but they also walked beneath the shadow of those daggers, never entirely safe, never entirely secure. And so, as the centuries unfolded, the empire continued, its story told not only in victories and monuments, but also in the whispered plots, the hidden blades, and the sudden silences that followed the fall of those who once seemed untouchable. As the long centuries of Roman history unfolded, the presence of assassination remained like a shadow cast across its story. From the fall of the Gracchi brothers, through the rivalry of Marius and Sulla, to the fateful Ides of March, and onward into the palace intrigues of emperors, the quiet truth remained that power in Rome was never without peril. Men could rise with brilliance, command armies, sway crowds, and fill temples with their names, but none could entirely escape the reach of daggers hidden in cloaks or poisons mixed into cups. Assassination in Rome was not always the act of hatred or madness. Often it was carried out in the name of ideals, or at least in the belief of them. And Brutus and Cassius told themselves they acted to save the Republic. Senators who struck down Domitian whispered that they were freeing Rome from fear. Guards who turned on Commodus thought of the empire's dignity rather than their own. Yet whatever the reasons, the outcome was nearly always the same. The death of one man did not heal Rome's wounds. Instead, it opened new uncertainties, and in the silence that followed, another figure rose to fill the space. The Republic, once so proud of its laws and traditions, had been broken by cycles of violence and rivalry. Assassination became one of the many signs that it could no longer endure. The death of Julius Caesar, intended to preserve the Republic, instead hastened its end, ushering in the reign of Augustus and the empire that followed. The deaths of later emperors did not restore liberty, nor did they return power to the Senate. They simply reminded all who lived in Rome that rule by own man carried with it both grandeur and danger, that emperors could build monuments and lead armies, but they too were mortal, bound to the same frailty as the people who lived beneath their reign. And yet Rome endured. The empire lasted not for decades, but for centuries, its frontiers stretching from the windswept shores of Britain to the deserts of Syria, from the forests of Germany to the sands of North Africa. Its roads tied the world together, its legions marched in discipline, its cities echoed with markets, forums, and temples. Through all of this, the rhythm of daily life carried on. Farmers planted their fields, craftsmen shaped their wares, families gathered in courtyards, and children recited their lessons. Even as emperors fell to conspiracies, the empire itself continued, vast and resilient, as though the lives of individual rulers mattered less than the weight of the whole. In this way, the assassinations of Rome remind us of something quiet but lasting, that history is shaped not only by the mighty, but also by the enduring. Daggers may have ended the lives of leaders, but they did not end Rome. Each time a ruler was struck down, the city carried forward, its people finding ways to adapt, to endure, and to continue the long story of their civilization. When we look back now, the names of assassinated men stand out, Tiberius Gracchus, Gaius Gracchus, Julius Caesar, Caligula, Domitian, Commodus. But alongside them are the countless unnamed, those who whispered in the dark, who carried blades beneath their cloaks, who risked everything for ambition or for ideals. Their stories are harder to know, but their presence is certain, for assassination was never the act of one alone. It was the result of conspiracies, alliances, fears, and hopes, all woven together into choices that could not be undone. Over time, the empire grew weary. By the 3rd century, assassinations and coups became almost expected. Few emperors died peacefully in their beds, and soldiers grew accustomed to acclaiming new rulers, only to see them fall again. The purple robe of the emperor, once a symbol of majesty, became instead a dangerous garment, a mark that invited suspicion and envy. Even so, Rome endured until the weight of centuries, invasions, and internal strain at last brought it to its decline. The legacy of assassination in Rome is not only one of violence, but also of lessons. It shows us the fragility of power, the danger of ambition unchecked, and the limits of violence as a tool of politics. It shows, too, how people adapt, how, even when rulers fell, life found its way forward. The markets reopened, the temples filled with worshippers, and the rhythms of ordinary days continued, even as history shifted in the palaces and the Senate. When we speak of Roman assassins now, we do not speak only of blades in the dark or blood in the forum. We speak of the larger story they belong to, the story of a republic that became an empire, of men who believed they could shape destiny with steel, and of a people who endured it all, carrying their civilization across the centuries. In the quiet of reflection, one sees that assassination did not truly change Rome so much as reveal it. It showed the ambition of its leaders, the fears of its senators, the restlessness of its armies. It revealed both the grandeur and the fragility of a city that wished always to be eternal. And though the men who died are remembered for the manner of their deaths, Rome itself is remembered for the endurance of its life, for the way its legacy has outlived them all. And so, as the long story of Roman assassins draws to a close, we are left not with the sound of daggers striking, but with the softer truth that history, however violent at times, always returns to stillness. The Republic gave way to empire, emperors rose and fell, and yet beyond it all, the city of Rome continued, its people, its culture, and its memory stretching forward, whispering to us still of shadows, of power, and of the quiet resilience of time.